welcome. My name is Una Chaudhuri. I teach here in the departments of English, Drama, and Environmental Studies here at NYU. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. This event is being put on actually by a number of different groups. The NYU Animal Studies Initiative is one of them. The Humanities Center, in particular their Environmental Humanities series, is also co-sponsoring, and the Department of Cinema Studies is a third co-sponsor. And we thank them all for their support. It's a great pleasure to welcome and to present to you one of the very bright lights of our field of animal studies, Anat Pick. Anat is Senior Lecturer in Film Studies at Queen Mary's College, University of London. And her work focuses on the relationship between literature, film, and ethics beyond the human. At the heart of her writing and teaching, and she works across image and text, are questions about the more than human dimensions of ethics, broadly defined as an openness towards the living world. In her first wonderful book, Creaturely Poetics, Animality and Vulnerability in Literature and Film, Anat offered an approach to literature and film that was based on the shared bodily vulnerability of humans and non-human animals. She's also the co-editor of a volume entitled Screening Nature, Cinema Beyond the Human, which intersects film studies, and the emergent fields of eco-criticism and our own critical animal studies, in order to illustrate a non-anthropocentric understanding of the cinematic medium. Anat has a new book just out, her most recent book. It's entitled Maureen, and it's a work of creative nonfiction that explores the commonalities between vulnerable humans and animals in institutions like the nursing home and the factory farm. Currently, Anat is working on a new book. It's a very exciting project that some of us have heard different pieces from. It's called Vegan Cinema, Looking, Eating, Letting Be. And it draws on Simone Weil's analogy between looking and eating and her key concept of attention. The book argues for cinema's paradoxical capacity to retreat from the objects it captures, frames, and records. A form of looking that refrains from consuming the objects of sight. This type of gaze is conservationist in that it acknowledges the autonomous existence of beings and things and lets them be. The nonviolent gaze also offers an alternative to the modes of looking that have famously been critiqued by feminist and post-colonial theories. Nonviolent looking in the realm of art reflects the practice of veganism in the personal realm. Both embody an impossible but politically valiant attempt to engage with the world without consuming it. Anat's talk today is from a different project, I believe, and it's called Sparks of Life, Electricity, Animality, and Cinema. Welcome, Anat.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, so it's actually taken from, it is a bit from the Vegan Cinema book, but it's an illustration of what a vegan gaze does not look like, the opposite of a vegan gaze, which is a devouring gaze that consumes the animal that it films. It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York. I'm stupid about executions. The idea of being electrocuted makes me sick. And that's all there was to read about in the papers. Goggle-eyed headlines staring up at me at every street corner and at the fusty, peanut-smelling mouth of every subway. It had nothing to do with me, but I couldn't help wondering what it would be like, being burned alive all along your nerves. I thought it must be the worst thing in the world. So begins Sylvia Plath's novel, The Bell Jar, published in 1963. Its rather flippant opening, they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, but I didn't know what I was doing in New York, is in fact a triumph of literary compression. The Rosenbergs' electrocution, it turns out, has everything to do with the novel's narrator and main character, Esther Greenwood's, own fate as the subject of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. From ECT to electrical execution, electricity exudes ambivalent powers, visible and imperceptible, life-giving and lethal, healing and punitive. In his study of torture techniques, Darius Rejali has shown how, as an instrument of stealthy bodily control, electricity is characteristically democratic. It suits open societies where public scrutiny provides legitimacy to power under the auspices of human rights. In a world that touts the values of transparency and humaneness, electricity is an ideal torturing tool because it leaves few traces on the bodies of victims. The history of the rise of electrical power is embodied by one of its most famous proponents, Thomas Edison. Edison played a key role in the commercial electrification of America, as well as in the development of motion picture technology and the electric chair. Electrocution and early cinema intersect in interesting ways, not least in their use of animals as subjects of experimentation and display. Though Edison opposed capital punishment, he campaigned vigorously for electrical execution in the state of New York, and while he espoused compassion for animals, his New Jersey laboratory hosted numerous animal experiments on dogs, cows, a horse, conducted by the engineer Harold P. Brown, as part of Edison's bid against alternating current, or AC, promoted by his rival, George Westinghouse. Although Edison's direct current, or DC, system finally lost the so-called War of the Currents, New York inaugurated electrical killing with the execution of William Kemmler on August 6, 1890. The electric chair combined the deadliness of AC with the supposed humaneness and swiftness of electrical killing. Animals are also at the origins of ECT technology, pioneered in 1938 by the Italian psychiatrist Ugo Carletti and Lucio Bini. Carletti witnessed the electrical stunning of pigs in a Roman slaughterhouse, which induced convulsions in the animals. It was the seizures, rather than the electricity, that Carletti and Bini deemed beneficial for the treatment of severe psychosis. The animal origins of the technique still underpin ECT's controversial status. A 1979 New York Times Magazine article portrayed Carletti as a caring physician whose slaughterhouse investigation represented his attempt to test the effect of electrical current without endangering human life. While anti-psychiatry advocate and vocal opponent of ECT, Dr. John Friedberg, alleged that Carletti's visit to the pig slaughterhouse gave him the inspiration to treat humans as pigs by shocking them. So what I'm going to try and do today is trace the connections, or the scorched intersections of discipline and punish that determine the treatment of delinquents and beasts, from Plath's crazed female to the man-killing elephant Topsy, whose death by electrocution in 1903 at Coney Island was filmed by Edison in the early Actuality, Electrocuting an Elephant. Topsy finds herself at the center of different derivations of electrical power that course through the bodies of animals and humans and confuse neat delineations of species. Topsy's film spawned multiple afterlives in the form of YouTube videos, short fiction, journalism, and also film theory, which I'll talk a little bit about too. Over the years of thinking about animals in film, Electrocuting an Elephant has been, for me personally, the kind of bedrock of animal cinema. It combines the prowess of the cinematic apparatus, the ambivalence of electricity as, the ambivalence of electricity as an animating and lethal agent, and the spectacle of vulnerable animals that arouses both compassion and cruelty, I think. As the building blocks of cinema, power, spectacle, and the susceptible living body are integrated by electricity, whose iterations as killer, torturer, and healer reveal the fundamental tensions of cinema itself. Electrocuting an Elephant is 1 minute long, and I should give you a little bit of a warning that it's short and brief and silent, but it's a difficult film. It's explicit, so I hope that you're okay about me screening it. I think it's important to screen it because I'm going to be speaking about the way in which it's structured cinematically. So I'm not screening it simply to shock, no pun intended. So Electrocuting an Elephant is, as I said, it's very brief. It's under 1 minute. It was shot in front of Coney Island's Luna Park, on the site of cinema's birthplace of the fairground. Although Topsy is not the first to die on film, this would be Edison's 1895 film, The Execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Electrocuting an Elephant is a first real execution recorded on film, so it's special in this regard. So who was Topsy? I don't know how many people are familiar with her story. Some people are very familiar with it, some people may not be, so I'm going to briefly tell you a little bit about who she was and how she came to Coney Island. Topsy arrived in the United States as a baby in 1876, probably from Ceylon, Sri Lanka of today, and she was sold to P.T. Barnum's rival, the Adam Forepaw Circus, that had initially claimed her as the first American-born elephant, which was not true. Named after a slave girl in Uncle Tom's Cabin, Topsy would end up at Thompson and Dundee at Coney Island's Luna Park. Forepaw's son, Addie, beat her so badly that her tail broke, and she came to be known as Crooked-Tail Topsy. It was standard practice for performing elephants to be beaten, stabbed, choked, shot, or burned, and some elephants fought back. After years of abuse, Topsy retaliated and killed 3 people, one of whom presumably had tried to feed her a lit cigarette. Elephant executions were not uncommon. From the very first elephant brought to America in 1796, circus elephants suffered premature and violent deaths. When hanging Topsy was rejected as impractical, Edison stepped in and offered to electrocute her and film the event. Lisa Cartwright called the film a ceremony of corporal punishment. And in the bizarre ceremony that constructs Animality as pathologically criminal, electricity purports to redress pathology through the use of progressive technology. 1,500 people were present at Topsy's execution, and countless others have since watched her die. So I will show you the film the first time. Before turning to these afterlives that I was talking about in the form of other pieces of fiction and journalism, I'm going to say something about the importance of this film for the understanding of the cinematic medium in film theory. There's been some great writing on the film not from an animal perspective or an ethical perspective, but from the perspective of the grammar of the cinematic medium. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it's relevant to the broader discussion. Two of the most attentive readings of the film are in a book by Marianne Doan called The Emergence of Cinematic Time, Modernity, Contingency, The Archive. It was published in 2002. And more recently in a book by Scott Combs that's called Death Watch, American Film, Technology, and the End of Life, which was published in 2014. Doan's book is concerned with cinema's technological promise to capture time in the face of the frenzied and contingent experience of modernity. Doan posits the concept of the event as some kind of a solid moment within the contingent flow of life. As the contingent event par excellence, death is one of cinema's prime objects of fascination and recording. And what this means, according to Doan, is that Electrocuting an Elephant seeks to delineate the event of Topsy's death as closely as possible. There are two shots in Electrocuting an Elephant. You may have not noticed that if it's... so is it okay if I screen the film again, or is it too much? Okay, and I'll show you the two... You'll notice that there are two shots in the film. So there are two shots in Electrocuting an Elephant, separated by an undisguised cut between Topsy's being led to the place of her execution, shot 1, and there was the cut. So between that and her collapsing onto her side engulfed by smoke are extraneous non-events. Topsy being strapped into place, fitted with a wooden frame, wired to the generator in preparation for the administration of 6,600 volts of electricity. The cut excises the so-called dead time between the two main actions of Topsy's arrival at the gallows and the execution itself. It removes any excess material to configure the event more clearly, to try and capture that pure moment. And Doan calls this strategy, very interestingly, she calls it a denial of process, which of course has also judicial overtones, but she doesn't really talk about that. She talks about the denial of process as a way of ensuring the spectator's experience of continuous time. Yet, despite its best attempts to isolate the authentic moment of death, of Topsy's death, Doan writes that the film's aspiration to convey the real time of the event is only ever that, an aspiration. Even without cuts or camera stoppages of any sort, the actuality is destined to produce only the sign of time, only a kind of copy of time, not the actual event itself. Doan compares Electrocuting an Elephant to another Edison film, the earlier execution of Czolgosz with a panorama of Auburn Prison, which was made 2 years earlier in 1901. Obviously, it's a fictional, it's a reenactment of another electrical execution. And Doan writes, although each of these films clings to a referential event, a historically specific moment, what they demonstrate above all is the indeterminacy, the instability, and imprecision of cinematic time. While death would seem to mark the insistence and intractability of the real in representation, the moment of death is unknowable and, as it were, unseeable. And I think if you try to figure out where is the moment of death in this film, it's very difficult to do. In political terms, however, in ethical terms, I would argue that the denial of process in Electrocuting an Elephant becomes something more than an act of temporal compression. It becomes a denial of process in a different way. Its function is censorious, and it works to reinforce certain ontological assumptions about animal life and death. The cut does not merely secure, however tenuously, the experience of continuous time, but defines what we should or should not perceive as an event, what counts as happening on screen. The decision is ideological in two ways. First, the film seems to present as instantaneous what in reality was an unwieldy process, since, as Scott Combs notes, and I quote, the voltage needed to secure instantaneity was and is largely theoretical and subject to horrific miscalculations. The illusion suppresses the truth that despite the prevailing myth of instantaneous electrical death, Topsy's execution would have been anything but instantaneous. The second thing that is, I think, the second type of ideology at work here, enabled by the cut, is that the cut also ratifies certain ideas about animality. By eliminating particular actions, movements, and durations as superfluous to the death of the animal, denying the process of Topsy being strapped into place and the time it took before throwing the switch, the film deems these moments as insignificant. But who knows what these absent moments might have yielded, might have told us. A clue is provided by Topsy's brief shuffling of her front right foot. I'm not going to show the film again, but you can watch it on YouTube. And you can see her kind of shuffling her front right foot, which I think is such a tiny but incredibly moving gesture that completely breaks this idea of trying to compress time and delineate an event very clearly. Her shuffling of her front right foot, trying in vain to shake off the electrode. This tiny gesture tells us something about Topsy's disposition in the seconds before her death. It refutes the notion of animals as automatons that physically react but do not reflectively respond. What Nicole Shukin describes as, quote, the notion that animals are capable only of a physical system of signaling and a pre-wired response. Had the process, including the fact, the true fact, that Topsy refused to proceed to the site of her execution, had that been filmed, it would have amounted to something like Famous Last Words, reinscribing the cinematic event via a different view of animality. It's not only the time that passed between Topsy's arrival and death, but also what came next that is omitted from the film. In his biography of Topsy, the journalist Michael Daly writes that Topsy was measured and it was recorded that she was 10 feet tall and 10 feet 11 inches long. The autopsy was then performed on the spot. The heart and stomach were removed for the biology department at Princeton. The taxidermist Hubert Vogelsang, you couldn't make it up, began skinning her. Some of the hide would be used to cover Thompson's office chair, and 2 of the legs would be fashioned into umbrella holders. The head was buried, this is an important fact that will pop up later, the head was buried in a remote, unmarked patch behind the stables. So these contexts are completely lost when cinematic attention is focused on the alleged instantaneity of electrocution. If real electrocution was theoretically but not actually instantaneous, cinematic death, too, is the mirage of immediacy. In his book Death Watch, Scott Combs pushes further Doan's deconstruction of the cinematic instant of death, and he writes, those in front of and behind the camera have tried to figure out whether death has a moment, if there is a way to visualize it as one instant or many, and if many, how to prioritize one over the others, and if so, which one to privilege. In short, the act of dying is an object with no certain culmination or boundary. So according to Combs, in cinema, there is no death. There's no death in cinema, only dying, this kind of process of dying. And one dies more than once, therefore. Combs identifies not one, but multiple cuts in electrocuting an elephant. The proliferation of cuts undermines the attempt to fix a single moment of death. So against Doan that sees a single cut, he actually says, if you look at the film, you can see the camera stoppages throughout, kind of starting and stopping and starting and stopping. And he writes, looking closely at Topsy's throws, we can see more stoppages where the camera was turned off, then back on again, then back off, as if the operator were unsure whether her convulsions had concluded, or indeed, what might constitute a conclusion. The elephant's death appears unruly, even for a camera complicit with electrocution. In fact, whether or not Topsy died of electrocution at all is inconclusive, for before being shocked, she was fed carrots laced with potassium cyanide. And Daly, her biographer, writes, once the motion picture camera stopped filming, the donkey engine was set to work, cinching the noose tight around Topsy's neck and holding it tight for a full 10 minutes. Only then, when she had been triply killed and there was not the slightest chance she was alive, did the 3 veterinary surgeons approach and pronounce her dead. So Electrocuting an Elephant is an unfinished film because it lacks the moment that Combs calls registration, where a third party confirms the death of the subject. No such registration occurs in Edison's film. Rather than compressing and suturing time, the cuts that he identifies in the film multiply, this is him, multiply the observable death moment. And he continues and says, eternal repetition doesn't keep the elephant alive, it keeps her dying. These remarks recall Akira Lippitt's important study of cinematic animality in his book Electric Animal. And Lippitt explains that in the absence of language or logos, animals cannot comprehend their own death. This is a very common philosophical position, that animals can't really die because they don't possess rational, reflective thought, and therefore they cannot comprehend their own death. So animals can perish biologically, physically, but they cannot truly fully die in the way that we can, supposedly. But this view of what Combs calls the animal's serial existence in its unknowingness of death again props up a sharp ontological distinction between humans and animals. And recent research shows that animals, especially elephants, do possess some sort of an understanding of death, their own and others, and they mourn their dead and they even experience grief. So there's reason to be skeptical about these very sharp ontological distinctions that deem animals incapable of death. Though she is denied eternal life, Topsy endures in different media platforms. Lydia Millett's short story, Thomas Edison and Vasil Galakov, finds Edison a haunted man, replaying the grisly footage of Topsy's execution night after night while conducting elaborate conversations with the elephant. How many times have you died? 1,000 times you have died, 1,000 and 1,000. I've seen it, like the millions of stars in the sky. And still you speak to me, you hold me in your dead eyes. Topsy has become, in that story, an irascible Christ figure. And this is Edison getting drunk and watching a film over and over again in the story. And he says, yes, 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 you are the Savior, but I see now that you do not forgive me. What did you say to me? I hear you. You say, I do not forgive. You say, this is my gift to you. I will never forgive. Now and forever, you are not forgiven. Topsy's death is a wound that refuses to heal. This was also true in real life. In 1904, a Coney Island laborer named Anthony Pucciani claimed that he was visited by Topsy's ghost. And this is quoted in, he's Daily, in his biography, talks about this, and Daily writes, the big astral figure stood over him with her feet set wide apart, sparks issuing from her trunk, her eyes glowing brightly like blown coals. 2 other workers said they too saw the dead elephant. And then in 1905, a visiting herd of performing elephants became agitated when approaching the far end of Luna Park. It turned out to be the very spot in which Topsy's head was buried. The skull was duly dug up and removed, and the elephants presumably went quiet again. If Electrocuting an Elephant perseveres as an indictment of the ingenious cruelties of electrocution in film, this is partly because in 1896, before the film was made, the War of the Currents between Westinghouse and Edison had actually been decided in Westinghouse's favor. So often this film is described as Edison made this film because he was trying to win the War of the Currents against Westinghouse. And this comes up in a lot of the literature. But in fact, there was no reason to make the film because the war had been decided and Edison lost, and the Westinghouse system became the system that was used. Why then did Edison make the film? So there are all kinds of different explanations as to why, and a compelling explanation is, for me at least, is offered in a great book that isn't so often read, I think, these days. A book by Louis S. Foyer. It's a monumental study called The Scientific Intellectual, published the very same year as The Bell Jar, 1963. And Foyer's book is a sociological and psychological portrait of the men who led the scientific revolution as adherents to what Foyer calls a hedonistic libertarian ethics. Rationalist, liberal, and non-sectarian. Fourier did not believe as Max Weber did, so his whole shtick is really an argument against Weber in explaining the scientific revolution, and Fourier claims that the rise of modern science was the result against Weber's thesis that the rise of modern science was the result of the Protestant ethics of asceticism. For Fourier, on the contrary, the ascendancy of science in the 17th century confirmed the triumph of a liberal and optimistic worldview. As economic prosperity increased, the Calvinist ethics lost its purpose and was superseded by the hedonistic libertarian one. In its 1992 edition, the Scientific Intellectual included a new introductory section on Edison, whose antipathy to puritanical austerity earned him the title of what Fourier calls the anti-ascetic inventor. Instead of concerning himself with efficiency of production, like the British pioneers of the Industrial Revolution, Edison's inventions pertained to consumerism and the pursuit of happiness. But if electrocuting an elephant is anything to go by, while the punishing spirit of Calvinism made possible a host of sadomasochistic cruelties, the exuberance of scientific experimentalism had or bred its own moral pathology. Fourier doesn't suggest if and how Edison's involvement with the invention and introduction of the electric chair fits into the hedonistic libertarian ethics. Still, I see no real contradiction between Edison's secular ethics of modern enjoyment and the bleakness of electrical death. Nor is this simply, I think, an instance of bad use of modern technology, for the chair was conceived as the height of progressivism. That Edison seemed prone to the more egregious uses of technology suggests some of the dangers of the hedonist libertarian ethics, not least its entanglement with powerful economic and financial interests. So in fact, the different pieces of the apparatus used in Topsy's execution were owned by different commercial bodies. So the wires, for example, that were used to electrocute her were owned by speculators, not by Edison himself. So it's interesting to see the way in which economic powers are involved, economic interests are involved in this in the creation of this phone. Perhaps the duality of enjoyment and power that electricity signifies highlights the fallibility of the self-reliant humanist ethics. And nowhere is technology as a vessel of mass entertainment more evident than in the cinema, and electrical violence is part of the story. Combs notes the pre-cinematic quality to Brown's experiments. It's Brown again. And Combs likens this kind of scene in Edison's lab he compares it to slasher movies, contemporary slasher movies like Saw, like the Saw franchise, for example. And he says, substitute the horse with a thief, the electrical cord with a helmet of knives, Brown with another sadistic scientist torturer, and move the scene from Edison's lab to a not clearly accessible torture chamber, and you get Saw 4 or something awfully close. Torture prolongs and multiplies the instant of pain and stretches out the moment of death. Brown's experiments, as well as electrocuting an elephant, could thus be seen as cases of electrotorture, the flagship torture technique of modern democracies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about electrotorture and ECT. In the 1880s, electrocution became the primary method of execution, a position it held for 3/4 of a century, even as grisly experiments and botched human executions attested that electrical death was complicated. Darius Rejali traces the affinities between the electric chair, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, and electrotorture, all of which pertain to electrocution as what Rejali calls a clean technique of bodily coercion. Folded into the evolution and implementation of clean techniques is the question of humaneness and the discourse of humanism. Invisibility and cleanliness made electricity compatible with the principles of transparency, accountability, and human rights precisely because its effects are unseen. Its scientific character further endowed electrocution with a kind of prestige. Electricity belongs to a particular order of violence because the pain and damage it causes are harder to spot. This ambivalence extends well into the present moment. So I'm sure, as everybody knows, on April 4th, 2015, in South Carolina, African-American Walter Scott was shot multiple times by white policeman Michael Slager after a traffic stop. Eyewitness Phaeton Santana, who filmed the incident on his cell phone, claimed that Slager had first used a stun gun on Scott. And very recently, September 16th of this year, in Tulsa, Terrence Crutcher, also African-American, was shot and killed by white police officer Betty Jo Shelby. A second officer on that scene, Tyler Turnbow, had reportedly tased Crutcher before Shelby shot him. As with Rodney King in 1991, police use of electroshock on suspects is not easily visible, either on the victim's body or in the footage. So if you look at the 1991 footage, the famous King footage, you can see the beating, of course, but the fact he was given a two massive bolts of electricity is not discernible from the footage. It is the apparent invisibility of the Tommy A. Swift electric rifle, or taser, that renders it a weapon of choice of law enforcement in poor communities of color. A democratic public, writes Rajali, may be outraged by the violence it can see, but how likely is it that we will get outraged about violence like this that may or may not leave traces, violence that we can hardly be sure took place at all? Debates over visibility and violence were, and still are, at the heart of animal advocacy. Since the 1820s, visible cruelty to animals has become more or less unacceptable, leading to methods of covert violence, like electrical stunning, methods that secrete violence in the act. The effect of these shifts in visual codes and techniques unsettles the parameters of seeing in general, an unsettling to which cinema too bears witness and which it also amply exploits. Rajali proposes what he calls a monitoring hypothesis, according to which, and I quote him, where public monitoring is present, torture favors covert coercion. To the extent that public monitoring is not only greater in democracies, Rajali explains, but that public monitoring of human rights is a core value in modern democracies, it is the case that where we find democracies torturing, we're also likely to find stealth torture. In the twofold meaning of monitor in his monitoring hypothesis, as public overseer and as screen, lies the relationship between seeing and not seeing in open societies such as the one that gave rise to Electrocuting an Elephant, a film that invites us to witness extreme yet oddly covert violence. In a section in his book, which is, by the way, called Torture and Democracy, in a section called Remembering the Animals, Rajali writes, "The story of shock, medical and judicial, began as an animal story. Men electrified dogs, cows, horses, pigs, and even an elephant. It is also a story about the public's growing appetite for meat." As the real Topsy, the fictional Greenwood, and the numerous anonymous human and animal victims of electrocution indicate, the discourses of humanity and animality, overlaid with the markers of race, gender, class, and species, play a part in the selection process of suitable candidates for electrocution. As soon as they arrived in America, elephants were recognized as intelligent, complex beings with rich internal lives. This didn't stop trainers, owners, or passers-by from subjecting the creatures to violent treatment. The attribution of subjectivity allowed some elephants to be accused of malice. There were bad elephants just like there were bad people. Supposed kinship with humans privileges elephants for better or worse. It also made for bankable drama when elephants broke bad. Not only were some elephants considered plotters and criminals, their brain itself was imagined as the site of criminality. In 1894, a long-suffering zoo elephant named Tip attacked his keeper William Snyder, an attack that the New York Times described as treacherous. Tip was to be killed with poison, but he repeatedly refused the laced carrots and apples his killers handed him. It took about 10 hours to kill Tip, and after his death, this is also taken from Daly's biography of Topsy, after his death, Men with long knives worked through the night, skinning the corpse for the museum. The eyes went to the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary. The University of Chicago sought the whole brain, but settled for half, to examine the cause of the wickedness which made the killing of the animal necessary. Tip proved a useful commodity post-mortem. The violence he met with in life continued after his death. Whereas criminal elephants, like Tip and Topsy, sustained violence that inadvertently humanized them, the real Plath and the fictional Greenwood were subjected to scientific procedures that animalized them. Stephen Gould Axelrod has discussed some of Plath's most famous poems, like Lady Lazarus and the Jailer, as what he called torture texts. And while the bell jar doesn't really make use of the same psychic theater of torture as the poems, the novel's descriptions of ECT recall Rajali's descriptions of the weirdness of electricity, the fact it's extreme and yet also subtle somehow. So here's a little bit of from the bell jar to illustrate that. The aloof male psychiatrist, Dr. Gordon, carries out Esther's first electroconvulsive treatment. Dr. Gordon was fitting 2 metal plates on either side of my head. He buckled them into place with a strap, then dented my forehead and gave me a wire to bite. I shut my eyes. There was a brief silence like an indrawn breath. Then something bent down and took hold of me and shook me like the end of the world. Wee, it shrilled. Through an air crackling with blue light, and with each flash, a great jolt drubbed me until I thought my bones would break and the sap fly out of me like the split plant. I wondered what terrible thing it was that I had done. Esther undergoes her second ECT treatment, this time with anesthetic, under the supervision of the female psychiatrist, Dr. Nolan. When Dr. Nolan fails to inform Esther of the upcoming treatment, Esther feels betrayed. She says, if she told me the night before, I would have lain awake all night, of course, full of dread and foreboding. But by morning, I would have been composed and ready. I would have gone down the hall with dignity, like a person coolly resigned to execution. Dr. Nolan presents ECT as humane. She goes as far as telling Esther that some people even like it. But though less spectacular than the first, no blue flashes, jolting, or noise, both experiences recall coercive and punitive elements of ECT, while the latter experience harks back to the Rosenberg's execution, which opens the novel and kind of frames the whole novel. ECT has been in use in the United States since the 1940s. It was initially received enthusiastically. With the rise of the anti-psychiatry movement in the 70s, ECT's public image shifted. The bell jar invokes the power dynamics and gender politics inherent in the treatment, both in its contemporary Cold War context and historically in ECT's use of unwilling participants, mainly schizophrenics. But the power dynamics of electrocution is not straightforward. And we can see that both in the bell jar and in, I think, the film. In Topsy's case, the presupposing of animal agency justifies the administering of a lethal dose of electroshock, while in the case of ECT, pathological discourse seeks to restore patients' agency and choice. One would expect that the opposite were the case, that ECT would be on the rise where the famous talking cure fails, approaching human patients as biological systems that doctors can reboot through the use of ECT. ECT's anti-humanism doesn't merely rest in denying patients freedom and agency, not that is only in the ever-present risk of coercion, but presumably in the belief that language falls short and a mechanical rebooting is required. But when you read studies about ECT, it's actually not the case. ECT wasn't really used in that way. Not only was ECT not in conflict with the talking cure, it was seen to positively restore speech in patients with severe stutter. In both the human and the elephant case, then, something counterintuitive is taking place. Topsy is humanized by her electrocution, while ECT patients are not simply dehumanized. This is not to say that coercion and violence rooted in acts of species and gender profiling do not take place in Electrocuting an Elephant and the Bell Jar, only that oversimplified notions of animalization and dehumanization fail to capture the intricacies of the systems that control and even kill women and animals. Electrocuting an Elephant and its afterlives reveal the technological and cultural collusions that exert their power over the bodies of women and animals as the objects of permissible, semi-visible violence. In the 1880s, electrocution was embraced as the preferred method of state-sanctioned killing, and electricity itself was perceived as a natural gift, a testament to humanity's ability to discipline nature, which in turn becomes a force for societal disciplining. In this way, execution can be celebrated, in the words of Alfred Southwick, as the art of killing by electricity. In 1881, Southwick, who would later serve on the death penalty that he himself commissioned or lobbied to set up, conducted sadistic experiments on stray dogs in Buffalo. The art he so avowedly praised was that of the fictitious instant of death. Plath knew better. In Lady Lazarus, the fiendish, tormented speaker sees art not as the imaginary moment of death, but in the ongoing practice of dying. Dying, Plath writes, is an art, like everything else. Thank you.
I was struck in your discussion about this tension between, death and dying, but also so clean killing versus dirty killing, and the visible and the invisible. And it sounded like, to a large extent, it's a matter of critique and analysis. The Doan's analysis reveals one kind of configuration, and then Coombs seems to come and destabilize that. But one thing that I saw there that wasn't discussed by either one of them, and I was so surprised to see that it completely contravened my fantasy about electrocution, which was all the smoke, which turned it into a very different kind of event than I had expected, because it felt more as if we were then seeing the foundations of electricity, which is fossil fuel burning. And it also turned it into not a clean scene, but like being burned to the stake, something very anachronistic and pre-modern. So I wonder if you could talk about that a bit, please.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. It's exactly true that the assumption of cleanliness is an ideological imposition. It's not borne out by the visible evidence. So it's just fascinating to see how a piece of footage can be used in a certain way to show visibly that electrocution is clean and humane and quick, whereas all the other, as you say, the origins of the technique in animal bodies, really, fossil fuels, and are kind of creep up on and contaminate or expose it for what it truly is.
Because of the size of this particular animal, or would that have been the case in all the earlier?
The William Kemmler execution also was reportedly not clean. And by the way, the same argument goes on now about with lethal injection. That is now the same kind of debate is going on around the supposed humaneness of lethal injection, and the preference for lethal injection is it's supposedly more humane, but we now know that it too, when you actually look at the evidence, when you really look at it, it's not instantaneous, and so it leaves traces. It does leave traces. Rajali's point about it being a clean technique is that, in comparison to the more medieval, very spectacular types of torture that were meant to leave traces, on the body in grand fashion, that it's sort of clean. But I think, obviously, when you look at the bodies of people who have been executed, and that's definitely true of Topsy and also the William Kemmler execution, then they were not, strictly speaking, clean.
So in terms of cinematic technique, then, does that mean that it always involves this a kind of repression or subterfuge?
I think so. I think it's also similar to Doan's denial of process. She's denying, there are several denials going on here. And one of them is that there's this modern thing going on around electricity, but there's also signs of heavy kind of industrial and pre-modern. All of that, the scene is, and the smoke, right, is unclean, teetering on the edge of modernity, but not quite there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have another question.
Well, thank you very much. There's so much fascinating material here, and I'm afraid this is another one of those questions that's just an invitation to say more about some related things. And what I'm curious about in particular is the relationship between electrocution and modernity generally. And I mean, I don't know, and you will certainly know more about this, but killing people by electrocution didn't actually seem to be an idea that had legs. I mean, I don't know how far it went beyond America. And I'm particularly struck by the fact that France in the late 19th century was on the vanguard of modernity, and as far as I know, had absolutely nothing to do with this. And there's just another kind of interesting observation here about France, which is the guillotine was introduced initially precisely because it was on the vanguard of humaneness and humanity and modernity and so on and so forth, which then later we look back upon and actually see as torturous and horrible. So I'm kind of also struck by that similarity.
I mean, this is sort of similar to the point you were making, Una, about what counts as modern is a generation's. I mean, it's probably many factors, commercial factors, of course, involved, and I would say the prevalence of electricity in one place is to do with economic relationships, commercial opportunities that may occur in one place but not in another. And then what counts as modern is just a label that a society puts on something, on practices that it conducts to make itself feel, modern. Or
but in this case, isn't it also American? I mean, is there some? I think the question there is, and I think that can also be asked about ECT. I mean, did it have much of a life outside of America? I know it was very popular in America in the 50s.
Still conducted. To be totally honest, I don't know. I would need to research I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody, it would be, I don't know the prevalence of the use of the technique elsewhere. I mean, it was invented outside of, it was invented by Italians, but whether, I don't know how popular it was elsewhere. Does anybody know?
Certainly in literature, you only see it in American.
And films and films and books, of course, yeah.
Sure. No, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Anat. That was really a fantastic presentation. I was curious about a comment you made towards the beginning about the denial of process working in multiple ways, and you focus mostly on like the filmic elements of it. But I was thinking in the context of animals, actually, at least in a European context, being put on trial for things for hundreds of years, and then sort of getting to this point where the elephant's just going to get executed, and now maybe we've developed, when dogs bite people, now they just get killed. There's no process at all. But then, if that could also extend to some of the other things you focused on, and I don't want to make like a sloppy analogy, but some of the sort of modern day footage of people being killed by police, or even if there were instances of compulsory ECT. People were denied process, and I don't know. I mean, you see that in films. It seems to be like, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and stuff. But I don't know how much that actually happened to women.
I mean, towards just one point on ECT, that towards the end, I tried to argue that I think it's a complicated area, and I don't think it's wise to reduce ECT simply to coercion. Some people wanted to have it. Some people still want to have it. The practice itself has evolved. Even in the bell jar, there's once it's practiced with anesthetic, then once without, then with. So, but there's definitely that very troubling history that there's a denial of process that is part of the history and practice of ECT, which is undeniable. I mean, my whole point was kind of to think intersectionally about these various forms of denial of process. Actually, I didn't think of the whole paper is really about denial of process. So thank you for pointing that out. I did not even notice it, but I think these things are kind of parallel. Absolutely.
Anat, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm intrigued with the idea that you developed about the film was in two cuts, two sections. I'd noticed that, but I'd never really noticed it before until you talked about it, and then you referred to someone who said there was multiple cuts. I've often wondered whether there's actually more footage. Are there off cuts that never ended up being shown? And is there a definitive footage of the electrocution?
Yeah, we were just talking about that before, earlier today with Una, and I've been trying to find out. I spoke to Jonathan Burt about it, trying to figure out how many prints there were and what is the definitive version. And I haven't been able to find that out. So I think that the version that we have is probably the only version in existence, unless somebody knows otherwise. I don't think that there is lost footage, or even if there is, I don't know what it would. I mean, if there was, I don't know what it would show, but not to my knowledge, there isn't.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. I was struck by the fact you said that the film industry began partly in Coney Island, or
in the fairground generally.
In the fairground generally, which of course places it firmly within the sort of end of the pier freak show, mass entertainment that Coney Island was, I assume, already offering in those times. And when the smoke came out of the elephant, I immediately thought of the kind of performative smoke and mirrors three-ring circus feature of the elephants as warring symbols of the two circuses that were there. Mm-hmm. Do you see in it, or was there a sense of this being a kind of extension of an entertainment performance as an execution, something that people could look at as a kind of extension of the circus, and then for cinema as an extension of the circus?
Yeah, of course. It's known that cinema. So there's a very famous piece by Tom Gunning called "The Cinema of Attractions," where he talks about the history of early cinema as films were shown in the fairground as part of everything else that was going on. So you would go to the fairground, you'd see different kinds of performances, and film would be one of those performances. And there'd be a lecturer who would kind of talk you through the footage, and that was just one of the things that happened at the fairground. It was very much embedded in the rest of the attractions, and then it got kind of separated out and turned into a different kind of institution where you go and sit in the dark room and you're not supposed to talk. But that comes later, when cinema becomes more of a middle class pursuit. But it started as a non-narrative, spectacular attraction, just like a fairground ride, one of the rides, really.
So the people around you see in the film, who are they?
Some of them are people who work in Luna Park. You don't see the spectators who gathered to the 1,500 people who reportedly gathered to see the execution, but they were there, I think, to watch the curiosity with a combination of fascination and horror. Many of them found it unpalatable, but kind of, can't take your eyes off of it sort of thing. Very much in the way that we today treat gruesome footage. Only it was live. So, so yes, I think very, very closely related to the circus, a form of grisly entertainment.
Hi. I was actually going to ask a question about cinema of attraction, so it seems like a good moment to do so. I guess when I think about that concept, I often think about this sort of person in the film looking at the audience, right? The idea is like, this is this figure.
The exhibitionist.
Right, and you're like engaging, and you're not like a voyeur in the same way that you would be later,
Yeah.
in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I was wondering if Topsy's sort of gaze, and maybe this also might lead to questions about the devouring gaze versus the vegan gaze, but does Topsy's gaze make a difference here? Does it suggest that there's a really sort of like alternative narrative to the cinema of attractions when you're dealing with non-human life?
That's such a great question. Thanks. So maybe, if I understand you correctly, I would say that the alternative narrative has to be extracted from this film, and I think for me, it's the little, very easy to miss, all the small little gestures, because you can't see her. I mean, when you say gaze, obviously it's impossible to see her actual gaze, but the gaze can be anything. It doesn't have to be facial. It can be a gesture. It can be often with animals. I mean, with mammals, there's a gaze, but with other kinds of animals that perhaps we don't identify with, there are gestures. And this kind of film, what you see, if you look closely in enough times at the film, I think something like that does emerge, and that is a sense of her as a real individual, as someone who has feelings and thoughts and whose experience is there in the film. But you have to articulate it. I think it's definitely there. I don't know whether other people have that sense, but I think it's in the gestures, in this tiny gestures. Forget about the fact of the execution. Every little movement that she makes is an expression of herself and her experience, and that in a way redeems her. And I think you get that sense in the so-called afterlives, like the Lydia Millett story brings that alternative narrative out, right? Because it's about Topsy's, not revenge, but Topsy's afterlife as haunting Edison. And I don't think he was a haunted man at all in reality, but the fact that the film is continues to fascinate and continues to elicit so many different types of responses, including someone who's written a biography of Topsy, that to me that's the alternative narrative that comes out of the film, and you can find it in the tiny gestures if you look closely.
I wonder if that alternative narrative is better thought of not in terms of an alternative gaze, but in some other terms, where you're saying gesture or presence or some other kind of performativity that is not a gaze, to the extent that we...
Yeah, maybe the gaze... Yeah. Maybe the gaze is too reductive, but it certainly pushes her away from attraction. She's no longer an attraction. She's a person. She's someone who is more than a victim as well. She has agency.
Hi. That was so fantastic. Thank you. I guess I was going to say, well, maybe we could think of the circus as pre-training the audience to look at animal bodies in a certain way. So when we think about the Gunning's article, we can think about that, animal bodies are already spectacular, are already sort of like contained in this certain way, and the film sort of rehearses that or plays that out again on the set of Coney Island, where Coney Island really is like a theatrical backdrop to this action, this event that occurs. I don't know if that makes sense.
So
the circus has already been around for the modern circus for maybe like 100 some years,
Yeah.
120 years. And so spectators are already very highly trained in looking at animal bodies in a certain way. So in terms of like Topsy's gaze looking back, or what Topsy's relationship is with the potential viewer, is trained or is informed by circus and the history of spectacle.
Yeah, and she was a circus elephant.
Right.
She was many things actually. She was taking kids on rides at Luna Park. She also built Luna Park.
Right.
She carried the materials
right.
that actually
That's
built the park. So she was exploited on multiple levels and functioned as many things. And in the end, she retaliated. So you can also read animal resistance into her story. So she's just a really rich, tempting to say signifier, but she's a hero.